And then I thought, well, it is not important for scientific progress whether a theory is elegant or whether it is beautiful or whether there is a short distance between assumptions and conclusions. The only thing that matters is it true, empirically. And that's how I came to experimental economics.
Welcome to the UBS Center Thought Supply. I'm Roberto Weber. I'm a UBS Foundation professor in the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. And I'm pleased to have the opportunity to talk with Professor Ernst Fehr, who is also a professor in the Department of Economics here with me. And among many other things is the chairman of the UBS Center, also one of the most kind of recognized and established and successful behavioral and experimental economists over the past several decades. He is formerly a chairman of the Department of Economics during a period in which the department grew and expanded and became internationally recognized at a level that it was not previously. And he's held affiliated positions at prestigious universities like NYU and MIT, and in many ways is one of the kind of intellectual leaders of economics in Switzerland, in Europe, and worldwide. So it's a pleasure to have this opportunity to chat with you as part of this series.
A pleasure for me too.
So I look forward to kind of talking a lot about your experiences in your economic career as an economic researcher, your perspectives on the field and future directions. But I want to get started on kind of where you got started. So most of us have an idea of what drew us to economics because we weren't all born aware of what economics is or economic thinking. So what made you become interested in economics? What sparked that curiosity?
Well, I think it started with the recognition that there is a lot of injustice on the globe. So I started when I was 16, 17 years old. I started recognizing that there's a lot of poverty, and then I started reading about it, and a lot of this was associated with economic phenomena. And then I thought, studying economics is probably the best way to do something about it and to understand it better and to find remedies. And that's how I got into economics, basically.
And so did you get into economics directly when you started your studies at the university, or were you unsure then?
Well, Initially, I started studying political science and economics and philosophy. So that was possible that you combine it at the University of Vienna at the time. But in the end, it became just economics. I did some classes in philosophy and political science and sociology because I was always interested beyond the narrow boundaries of economics. And at that time, when I started economics, that was 1975, economics was a pretty narrow field compared to today.
Okay, in what ways? How is it different?
Well, there was almost no empirical research, very little empirical research. Most empirical research I encountered were some macro equations that were estimated. The computational power was also very low, so making a computation of a little model at the time took a whole day. But substantively, it was basically competitive price theory, general equilibrium theory, and a lot of theory and little empirical stuff. And yeah, it was. I would say it was a much more boring field compared to today.
Okay, I think a lot of people would agree with that. That's been a positive change in the field over the last several decades. Yeah. So, was there any class in particular that got you excited, or a topic that got you excited, or a professor that got you excited more than others?
Actually, no. So, at least at the University of Vienna, there were no professors that got me excited, but there were professors who were open-minded to discussing new things. For example, at some point the students demanded, we want to hear more about Keynes, we want to maybe have a reading group on Keynes or a reading group on Marx. And one of these professors was very open-minded and made that possible. But apart from that, I was not very much affected by the professor and largely self-driven. So I always was self-driven in a sense in my whole academic life. I mean, there were people who affected me, but these were people who wrote books. For example, Sam Bowles and Herb Gintis, they had a book, Schooling in Capitalist America, and they had other interesting books. And I thought these were topics that went beyond the narrow realm of economics very often, and I found them much more interesting.
So I guess around the time, experiments were not something that many economists did, although there were, Vernon Smith had already conducted experiments that were, kind of published in leading mainstream economics journals, and there were a handful. Did you encounter those while you were in Vienna, or was that later? Or?
Well, not during my PhD, not during my undergraduate studies. It was only later that I entered experimental economics, and that came about because I was totally frustrated with a paper that I had written, and it got rejected everywhere. And it was a paper on fairness in labor markets, because I was interested in labor markets, and in particular in the notion of involuntary unemployment. But by that time, the economists no longer spoke about involuntary unemployment as they were speaking about it in the old Keynesian days. They basically had abolished the concept. And I always thought, well, but there is such a thing as people wanting a job and not getting one, and there is a component of involuntariness in that. And so I became interested in theories that can establish what could be called equilibrium unemployment. These were efficiency wage theories, and also Akerlof's gift exchange theory. And I came across these models, and then I wrote myself a little paper on fairness and putting fairness into the utility function. And the economists didn't like that.
So it was a theory paper that theorists evaluated, and theorists weren't open to those types of things
totally,
at the time.
It was rejected everywhere. And then I thought, well, it is not important for scientific progress whether a theory is elegant or whether it is beautiful or whether there is a short distance between assumptions and conclusions. The only thing that matters is it true empirically. And that's how I came to experimental economics. So I thought with experiments I might be possible to document such a phenomenon.
And so is that what then led to the experiments on fairness in labor markets?
Yes.
And,
So this was my very first experiment that we did fairness in the labor market, so gift exchange. And we were lucky that the field was by then, this was the late 1980s, early 1990s, a bit more open-minded. And so we could sent it to the QJE, and it was a terribly written paper. They told us we should take some language polishers.
There was no AI kind of writing tool.
No, there was no AI writing tool, but they gave it was a revise and resubmit. So.
Oh, that's been an incredibly influential paper. Yeah. So given that there was not really a great deal of experimentation going on in economics at the time, like how did you, these days, PhD students or young researchers can take courses, read books. At that point, I guess you kind of had to figure it out, on your own. Did you read how psychologists did experiments? Did you how was the process of figuring out how to do an experiment in economics?
John Hay was a British economist, an experimental economist, and he came around 1988, 89, 90, every year for a 1 or 2 week course in experimental economics. And I took one of these courses to just learn the nitty-gritty of experimentation. But then there was no kind of role model for the type of experiment we wanted to do. The experiments were very different at the time. Competitive market experiments,
theory testing
experiments, and so we had to come up ourselves with ideas. And actually, one of my collaborators at the time said, "Why don't we just implement your theory paper?" So basically, we implemented the theory paper.
And so, at that point, I guess there weren't, the few experiments that were in economics were really, theory testing, kind of, market, different forms of comparing market outcomes under different institutions. But questions of fairness and social preferences still really weren't, that common in economics using experiments.
Oh, they were totally uncommon. I mean, this was an uphill battle for every paper, except the first one. But I was lucky because sometimes you are lucky because you have referees, a good draw of referees. And I think behavioral economics at the time, early 1990s, was still in a battle with standard neoclassical economics. And I think the early experimentalists like Vernon Smith and Charlie Plott and others, they didn't think that fairness was important. I mean, that, and experimental economics was very much supporting neoclassical price theory. And so it was new from an experimental viewpoint, but in behavioral economics there were some ideas around that fairness could play a role, but they have only been examined with survey questions and not with behavioral data. And so, and in particular in surveys, you cannot study the convergence properties of markets, for example. I mean, one argument was always, well, and later Vernon Smith made that argument. He was saying, well, fairness may have a short-run influence, but in the medium run and in a reasonable time, it just goes away. And demonstrating that it doesn't go away, that it can be a stable property of the behavioral equilibrium that's reached in an environment in which you allow for learning, in which you allow for convergence, was important. And that is what we achieved with the paper. There has been research in psychology, there has been research on the ultimatum game, and that indicated that fairness plays a role, but nobody could convincingly show that it plays a role in competitive market environments.
Yeah, I mean, I think that work of yours, like you say, some of your first experiments really were foundational in demonstrating that these fairness concerns persist in competitive markets with repetition, with competition on both sides of the market in some cases.
Yes.
I think that's really profound relative to kind of individual choice experiments or bargaining between pairs where you can get those types of fairness concerns to persist, but maybe in much more specific circumstances than in a competitive market.
Well, actually, there is also a lesson here for today. I think the route that behavioral economics has taken over time is behavioral economics got more and more individualistic. And current research practices, they are more and more survey-based, where you can't get at the convergence properties of markets. So, I
think that's even true. That's even true, I think, of many of the experiments, lab experiments, which have shifted back towards this kind of individual decision-making, risk,
exactly.
rather than trying to study kind of behavior in institutions or in markets where you really learn something by having a controlled environment where people are interacting with feedback and repetition.
Yes, and I think that is one of the distinguishing competitive advantages of the experimental method. Over surveys, for example, and over other data, that you can design the institutional environment and you can study how institutions and individual preferences interact and generate collective outcomes. I think that is a huge advantage, and it's totally underexploited in recent times, in my view.
I think one reason for that may be that the explosion of online experimental samples,
Exactly.
where you can easily do individual decision-making
Yes.
experiments, surveys,
Yes.
but we're doing an interactive market experiment.
Yes.
It's much more challenging. It's just shifted the cost, benefits in that direction, which is why we're seeing much more of that. But I definitely share your view that a strength of experimental methods is being able to kind of recreate, more complex things in controlled environments to study them. So I'm glad you brought that up. Yeah. So one other, kind of piece of your work where I think it has been, highly influential, and which, I think was one of the first papers of yours that I came across, or areas of your work that I came across, is on the idea of kind of altruistic punishment, or and if you think about it, it's a very interesting phenomenon, because it involves doing something destructive or harmful, but for something that's ultimately good and beneficial. So what led you to kind of become interested in that question and to start research on it?
The interesting thing is, the idea was born in a failed experiment.
Okay.
So we once ran experiments in the mid-90s with soldiers, with Austrian soldiers. Mm-hmm. And at the time, we didn't have a computerized laboratory for them. This was during a summer school. So we had access to this soldier subject pool. And we ran market experiments where one side of the market was very weak, deliberately. Mm-hmm. And so the other side of the market, the strong side, they reaped almost all the earnings. Mm-hmm. Because there was excess supply, okay, on the supply side. And so wages in that market, it was a kind of an experimental labor market, they became very, very low, and they earned almost very little. And then during the experiment, at some point, communication is forbidden in the experiment collective unless you allow it deliberately. So they had to make their decisions, their labor supply decisions, individually. Mm-hmm. But and then they saw the offer vector, so to speak, that came in from the other side of the market. Mm-hmm. And at some point, one guy shouted out aloud, "Let us form a union!" Okay. And he messed up the whole experiment, We couldn't really... And then interestingly, for 3-4 periods in this market experiment, there indeed did not take place any trade.
Okay.
But it was a failed experiment because this was not part of the experimental design that guys shouts and say.
So they were giving up money in a sense.
They were giving up money,
but they were doing it to protest these
exactly
these
collective
unfair
action.
outcomes.
They took implicit collective action, and fortunately, we had at the end of the experiment a survey where we asked the workers whether they are angry at the firms in the market, at the employers, because they offered so low wages. Mm-hmm. And then they said, yes, we are angry, somewhat. But then we also asked them, are you angry at the other workers? Yes, very much so. Because they always accepted these low offers and they undermined collective action. Mm-hmm. And so that was a situation when I noticed, this anger, when people free ride, because there's a collective good from the viewpoint of the workers that they achieve high wages for everybody. So this was basically, people were free riding on these potentially possible collective actions that they had established previously. And so I thought there must be a willingness to pay behind that anger. And that then led me to think about a cooperation experiment where I have, in addition to the cooperation stage, a punishment stage, where people had to pay money in order to be able to punish others, and that's what we implemented then at some point in 96, 97, and that led to the cooperation and punishment paper.
And why did you choose to study that in like a cooperation public goods setting rather than in the kind of original context where you discovered it like in a market where, because you do see workers striking, when there's a strike and people break the strike, they get sanctioned and punished, so you see a lot of this, and it would have been also potentially interesting to study there.
Yes,
but what made you decide to...
I had the idea to do this, but finally I didn't do it because I thought let's start simpler.
Okay.
Let's take the pure collective action problem and not embed it in a market environment, because that makes it much more complicated.
Okay.
And I wanted to generate clean evidence for a willingness to pay to punish, undisturbed by all kinds of other potential factors, you know. And this is why we went into a pure collective action environment or public goods environment to study this.
And going to the behavior itself, it seems like there's, different interpretations for the motive. One is that, people do it because they are angry and just want to kind of harm people who they think have been unfair. The other is that they are actually using it as a means to promote some positive social outcome. Where do you think the balance is between those two motives underlying that type of behavior?
I believe that most punishment comes from the desire to tell the other people that they did something that's not okay. Because in these public good games, if I cooperate and you defect, it's perceived as a kind of unfair advantage. I think there is the fairness motive playing a role here. And there are actually experiments later done that studied whether when you allow people to do the punishment, so to speak, I think the experiment was you don't know how the others respond, basically. You don't see how the others respond. And in particular, we had a design, for example, where you had in every period a different group. So I was in a group with you in one period, I was in a group with somebody else and others in another period, and in the next period again a different. So in that setup, I cannot have an impact on my group's contributions in the future. So that completely rules that out, and people still punish a lot.
Okay.
And this is why I believe that the fairness motive, and most of the punishment, 90% of the punishment is from those who cooperate on those who free ride, which also supports that interpretation.
I guess one interesting thing about the reasons it has an impact is also on the people receiving the punishment, because there's research showing that even when it doesn't actually cost you anything, just receiving these kinds of informal statements of you did something bad and I don't like it can doesn't have as big an effect as actual punishment, but it can actually lead people to change their behavior. So
that's true.
It's a combination of both the motive on the part of the sender to express this as pleasure and the fact we don't like being told that people don't like what we did can affect our behavior.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, we want to tell them, we do want to teach them a lesson if they free ride. And it's really a mix of motives that finally goes into this.
So let me ask you a question that I like to ask researchers, because we can all look at your kind of publications and see what's had the most impact. But I often find that when you ask people what work they're the most proud of, it is not necessarily the work that they're most well known for. In some cases it is, but not always. So what piece of research do you just feel like either the biggest sense of kind of accomplishment or personal fulfillment or
Well, when it comes to experiments, then the exciting thing is that the exciting situation occurs when you don't really know what's coming out. You are after a phenomenon that you would like to maybe document and isolate, but you're just not sure whether you will be successful. And I think that creates a very exciting situation because you are nervous, you are after something new, and at the same time it's not clear whether it can happen. So in this sense, for example, when we did the cooperation and punishment, I was very excited when we did it because we didn't know at the time that people do punish for non-selfish reasons. We didn't know that. But I give you another example. I once did experiments on money illusion, and when we did these experiments, money illusion was really a completely dead dog, let's say, because economists have moved away from explaining nominal rigidities with money illusion at the time, but the lab is at the same time a very good environment where you can study it in a rigorous way. And so we set up we were, setting up the design and doing the pilots, and then you get confounds in the pilots. I mean, this is, in the first moment you are frustrated, but at the same time it's a challenge. And I think this moving forward, more or less stumbling forward, so to speak, to a final design where you then have a design that works. I always found that very exciting.
Yeah, I share that in the sense that I think we really, at least I think what we want to do is learn, right? Yeah. And so basically, when we're learning through our research, it's to me the most exciting part of the process, rather than confirming something that we thought. And so, like when you mentioned this instance where your subjects, kind of unionized in an experiment in a way that you hadn't anticipated, and you realize, like, wait a second, this is something kind of interesting, and then you have to try to interpret it and follow it up with more research. I think sometimes the most unexpected things that happen in experiments that then puzzle you, frustrate you, but then you go back and learn from and realize, oh, that's something interesting, or some of the most exciting piece of research.
This happened several times to me. So, for example, when we did work, I told you at the very beginning of my career, I was interested in labor markets and the concept of involuntary unemployment, and I set up an experiment and finally to test this theory of involuntary unemployment, not the fairness one, it was another experiment, and actually we didn't really succeed, but the design was basically a blueprint for something much more exciting than finally. And it was about the idea that, for example, in contract enforcement, fairness motives can play an important role. Because if you are unfair to me, it may be, and you are the principal, it may be much more difficult for you to enforce the contract that you had considered for me. And so on. So basically, I think what I found most exciting in my research career is those situations where I want to go to A, I discover something along the road to A, and the thing I discover is much more important or interesting than A I was initially encountering, and I now go the other way and search for the other phenomenon. Exactly. So that is, I think, and I think people are often not open-minded enough to really refocus what they should do. They stick to their idea. No, keep an open mind and ask yourself, what is the really interesting stuff that you find?
Yeah, no, I always tell our students that they should design experiments to learn rather than show, because learning is really kind of where we advance science, where we satisfy the personal curiosity that got us into this, and so I think those are great. I think I fully agree with that. So a slightly related but different question, which is, doing experiments involves thinking of creative, interesting ways to get at something in the lab in an artificial way. I've found that sometimes it's fun to do, try to think of something new and implement it. Can you think of an experiment that you really had fun designing and implementing, where it was just kind of enjoyable in not so much in a scientific way, but just in a kind of creative?
Well, I'm probably too much purpose-driven to do something just for fun.
No, but where the process. So let me give you an example. Actually, so the very first time I saw you give a talk, I was a PhD student at Caltech, and you came and gave a talk, and you spoke about a design where you were trying to decrease social distance, and you had people I think it was something like where I held a color in my hand, and I knew what it was, but you didn't. And so we had to stare into each other's eyes and, like telepathically communicate what this piece of information was. I maybe, forgetting some details.
It was something like that,
But I remember like thinking, that just stuck with me. I mean, that was, 30 some years ago. And it just stuck with me as like, what a fun experiment to do, where the subjects have to sit there and, kind of like try to telepathically communicate. And, you know that that's not really the point of the experiment, but it just struck me as a very kind of fun thing to design and implement. And it seemed like you were having, fun, and the audience was having fun hearing about it.
That's true. I remember that presentation, and the audience had fun when I talked about that. But probably some people in the audience might also have thought, well, what a stupid idea. So
yeah. But I think there is something to, doing experiments. I mean, the experimental economics for a long time was basically take the theory, map it into something people do in the lab, like trying to make the instructions, everything is, as follow the theory as much as possible. But I think in some ways, to get at the real world, you building in kind of, fun aspects that, engage subjects and make, kind of, do something different than just a standard dry experiment, is really kind of part of like, creating social things in the lab that maybe are very hard to do if you're just following some kind of, path and diagram through a theory into an experiment.
I completely agree. I think sometimes pure theory testing experiments are pretty boring. And the real salt in the soup, or what makes the whole dish tasty, is when you deviate from theory, when you bring in new phenomena that have not been modeled in the theory, but where you have a hypothesis, they might have this effect or that effect. I mean, that's one of the big strengths of experiments, that you can study phenomena in a controlled environment, which is kind of theory-like, you have a controlled environment. I mean, the theorist has perfect control always, because he models all the things. Now you lose control because you have real human beings acting. These are not computerized artificial intelligence agents. And that's the big advantage of human experiments. But going beyond what's just in the theory is very often the most interesting thing, because theorists also learn something from that.
And also recognizing that there are social elements that are not in theory, that if you design an experiment carefully, you can incorporate into that environment, and therefore inform theorists and say, this is missing from your models, because and this is how we incorporate it into the experiment.
I completely agree.
So is there any research that you thought about doing but didn't do and wish you had done, that you at some point had an idea, maybe delayed starting it, or and then never got around to it, or found out someone else did it? Have there been any experiences like that?
I'm sure that there are, but they don't easily come to my mind. So I mean, there are research ideas out, or I have research ideas where I think these are ideas about unsolved problems that I think are still are ready to go, basically, and have not been properly solved. I have that. But it doesn't come to my mind that somebody did it, so to speak. I mean, for example, what I think is a big unresolved question is, how does society shape individuals' preferences? I think this is actually the question that a sociologist might want to ask. The economists haven't asked for a long time, and since I was a young student, always interested in that. Where do these preferences come from? Just assuming that they are there and stable is kind of a first step, an important step, and there is certainly some stability in the preferences that people have, but there is undoubtedly also movement in the preferences that people have, and we know very little where these which institutional aspects, which societal practices which parent-child interactions, which school features shape these preferences. And I think this is a big open question and a very interesting one.
And you've, one of the preferences that's associated with you that you've developed a theory of and provided evidence of is inequality aversion, right? The idea that we are motivated by a desire to kind of reduce inequality, even favorable inequality in some instances. You mentioned that part of the reason you got into economics was because you wanted to address the observation of inequality in the world. Where do you think do you have any insights into where our aversion to inequality comes from? Is it something that's just foundational, we're born with it? Is it something we're socialized into?
I think we have to distinguish here two dimensions. One is the evolutionary dimension, okay? And there are evolutionary models out there. I think Jürgen Weibel has some work on this and others. Where inequality emerges as part of an evolutionary equilibrium. But these models don't tell you much about the societal micromechanisms. They can be interpreted as cultural models, they can be interpreted as genetic models. There's just transmission from parent to offspring in some way, cultural or genetic. Now that's not so much what interests me. What interests me is kind of the microeconomics or microsociology of preference formation. So what is it in a child's experiences that make the child a pro-social child? What is it in the schools? How do school environments shape this? Teacher-child interactions. And this is an example of the type of questions that I think are not answered. I mean, there has been in sociology socialization research, but it's all correlational. And I think the modern tools of microeconometrics, we, as economists, we are experts in discovering and detecting exogenous variation that can be interpreted then as shifters of preferences. I mean, I give you one example. I have an unpublished paper, several times presented, but never written up, on the impact that the experience of Chernobyl, 1996, when the power plant exploded, has on people's time and risk preferences. So we have data of people who lived in 1986 when this happened in Ukraine, and the radiation cloud was randomly distributed across Ukraine due to weather conditions. And that's a beautiful natural experiment. And now we have experimental data about their time and risk preferences, and discovered that those who were more experienced to the radiation cloud, they are more risk averse and more impatient. This is one societal catastrophic event that may be a preference shifter, but there may be other things that are interesting to study, you know.
And I guess in terms of studying the development of these preferences, you know, in children, I mean, you know, you've done experiments on that, and a lot of it focuses on school-age children.
Yes.
But if we get those preferences when we're, you know, infants and toddlers from our parents or first interacting, there isn't a great deal of economic research, right? There's some developmental psychology work on kind of where those preferences come from, but I think in economics, that's something that hasn't been done to a great deal, or am I wrong about that?
Well, there is a paper by Kosse et al. Published in the Journal of Political Economy. Okay. And they have, I think, 7-year-old children that, and there's a treatment group that where a pro-social individual takes care of the children for 1/2 day per week for a whole year. And what they are able to show, because the children are randomized to treatment and control, is that having a pro-social caretaker who does whatever the child needs at the moment of time, let's say making exercises or reading or just interacting and have fun, shapes social preferences quite fundamentally. This is one of the good papers here in this domain.
Okay.
And it's 7-year-old children, so and they become much more pro-social. They share more. They have later on more, 3 years later they have more trust, and also first 1 year later and actually 3 years later they're also more successful in school then.
Okay. That's interesting.
Very interesting.
So we've talked a lot about research on social preferences and prosociality. Moving from research to kind of why it matters, what do you think are the impacts of this research and potential impacts for helping design better societies, better kind of organizations, institutions?
Well, I mean, if you think about other regarding preferences, which are social preferences, then they play a role basically in almost every interaction that we have. I mean, at the workplace, in the family, in schools, in clubs, in politics. I mean, they pervade every aspect of social life, almost necessarily, because I deal with individuals. And if I take other people's welfare into account in my interactions, that must matter in all these dimensions. But of course, as scientists, we want to know this more precisely. But for example, if you ask me, where does it matter most? Well, big examples are when people fight a dictatorship, for example. They take huge risks, usually, because there is the danger to go into prison. I mean, if you were among those who participated in demonstrations in Hong Kong, let's say, a few years ago, you took a risk. If you participated in demonstrations in 1989, 1990 in East Germany,
or in Iran,
or in Iran,
yeah.
I mean, people take huge risks. And we know from research, but it's also common sense, that the people who are more other regarding, by the way, and also those who are more willing to take risks, it's the two very important economic preferences, risk-taking and other regardingness, are when you, let's say, from a theory viewpoint, and there is also some evidence, important factors that make people willing to participate in these protests. And it's one of our most cherished public goods, democracy. I think, or take a state attorney in Italy who fights the mafia and takes huge risks for his own life and his family. I mean, these people are not just driven by self-interest. They are driven by some form of other regardingness.
So I fully agree with that, and I think that these types of other regarding and social motives are incredibly important, right? We do a lot of things because of norms, because we were talking earlier how just someone disapproving of you or even envisioning that someone may disapprove, like Adam Smith wrote about, this kind of imaginary spectator who we imagine judges our actions can motivate us to do things. So I fully agree these are strong motives, but turning from the science of understanding, which I think is important, to actually, let's say, policy and engineering better societies. What do these insights tell us? I think one potential example, going back to the study you mentioned on having pro-social mentors for children, one potential insight is that knowing who to place in what roles, right? Because the sorting between pro-social and non-pro-social individuals into different kind of industries, into different roles in politics, into different leadership positions, is potentially quite important. And if I want to design an organization that is, kind of more ethical or compliant, or a society that has better leaders, these things matter. So are there particular additional insights that, you think are relevant for?
Well, I think one thing you mentioned is the selection issue.
Yeah.
I think firms do select based on character.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just competence.
But do they select in the right way in terms of character?
It depends, but in most slots, I think they do.
Okay.
And they may have failed to do so in investment banking and other areas. But character plays often a role when it comes to the hiring of people. And this is one of the big advantages that companies have over states. I mean, companies can get rid of the bad apples. And when a village or a village may also be able to get rid of bad apples, but a whole nation, you put them to prison basically with the bad apples. But I think one other point here I could make is when it comes to compliance, for example, with social norms or any kind of change you want to manufacture in a company's corporate culture, let's say, or you want to change practices in companies to make the company more productive. Then my own research has proven to be quite important and quite useful in helping companies to achieve behavioral change. The behavioral change, because the reason is that many aspects of company lives are public goods. And why is that the case? Well, because labor contracts are imperfect. There's always the possibility to shirk. There's always the possibility to not do what is in the interest of the company. And because you have this incompleteness in the labor contract, many aspects of what's important for the companies require some other regardingness of the employees. They must take the welfare of the company to some extent also into account, or the welfare of other employees.
But I guess one potential source of tension there that comes to mind is companies, I agree with you, are interested in and to at least a moderate degree, if not more effective at trying to bring in people that will have the interests of the company and the shareholders and the senior leadership. That may not be the interests of society, as in many cases we see companies really wanting people to push the envelopes in terms of doing things that are borderline illegal, but increase short-term profits and share prices, and so I think that they are very good at screening people, but maybe not. Maybe we can think of better ways to align kind of like who they're screening with society's objectives rather than a narrower set of objectives.
I agree. I also agree that that we may need other institutions and changes in our institutional setup to make companies responsive to society's needs. And for example, Oliver Hart is these days, he's writing a whole book on that, how we should change, let's say, the composition of the board of companies and allowing not just shareholders be part of the board, to bring society's social preferences to bear on what companies do. But it's again an issue of bringing, let's say, some people have more social preferences than others. There's heterogeneity. And that and what economics has not yet done successfully, in my view, is to study the impact of that heterogeneity on institutional design. It's, you mentioned this, bringing the right people in the right in the right positions. And we try to do that, for example, by how we select judges. But depending on the political environment,
you may still not get the people that you want. I think that's an incredibly important open question, is how to use our knowledge, both of how preferences are heterogeneous, how they matter for decisions, but also how institutions actually function to try to figure out how to kind of create more, corporate boards that do a better job of kind of promoting society's interests rather than a narrow set of people's interests. I think that's an important open question that
I agree. Yeah.
So going back to kind of like what motivated you and what you've done a lot of research on, inequality aversion. So we agree it's kind of an important motive. We agree we've learned a lot about it, but societies seem to be getting more unequal in many cases. Is that because we don't care enough about it, or because the institutional forces are taking us away from more equality?
I mean, that is, in my view, one of the important insights I believe we had when Klaus Schmidt and I wrote the theory paper in 1999 on the theory of fairness, cooperation and competition, that we show that the institutional environment determines which type of individual has the decisive effect on the aggregate outcome. And more generally, the interaction between a heterogeneous preference pool of individuals and the institutional environment is key to understand social phenomena. And then when it comes to the increasing level of inequality, I mean, it's not so difficult to explain given our institutional environment that, I mean, if you have enough income on your side to go to invest in the stock market, over the last 30, 40 years, you became richer and richer if you had enough, a long enough time horizon. So the people who have their wealth in the form of stock, they naturally become much richer, you know. And then there have also been laws, you know. I mean, if you take the US, for example, unions play basically a very limited role, and they played a big role in 1950s and 1960s even. But now they play only a minor role. There has been kind of monopolization in markets. I mean, there is research on these big companies that there is more concentration in markets. So there is also, I think, an increasing recognition that labor markets are characterized by monopsonistic structures and not so competitive as many labor economists have thought for a long time. These are all factors that can explain the increase in inequality, but these are institutional factors, basically. And
I think it's coupled with, though, and this is an important part of it, is the fact that as people become wealthier on the upper end, their aversion to inequality is not sufficient that they really kind of invest and put effort into figuring out how to kind of bring people who are behind up. So people who get great returns in the stock market don't immediately turn to say, how can I use some of this wealth to make kind of other people better off? I think another great example in my mind is many people who think that equality is something that's valuable also invest a lot in giving their children advantages that other children don't have, if they can, right? I think that's something that we, a lot of us, a lot of people put money into making sure their kids get proper, tutoring and help. And, in the US, there's lots of money spent on sending them to the right schools that promotes, this perpetuating inequality among people who, if you ask them, is equality important, say, yes, it is. And so I think there's, again, these gaps between kind of like how inequality is produced and then people's actions that kind of follow this, these trends rather than trying to correct them.
I agree with what you say, but I want to add something important. The question is, what can you do at the individual level to reduce inequality? And in its core, it's a collective action problem that requires political action also. And this is the challenge. You need collective action, you need political means to correct the inequality.
And you need to get people to vote for policies and politicians that will correct this inequality, which again, maybe some of this work on pro-social motivations and norms can help kind of make those types of arguments more appealing and more socially supported.
But it means that as an individual, your best option, we care, we all, if we are healthy individuals, we care about the welfare of our children. And so naturally you want to do something good for them. And because there is no, and that this has an indirect effect of kind of petrifying or fostering overall inequality, yes, but they cannot do something about this at the individual level. They need, and this is why collective action is so important. We need to find forms of collective action that correct these trends, and if that is not occurring, then we move on with increasing inequality.
No, I fully agree. So let me towards the end of this conversation, let me turn from research and kind of your academic accomplishments and insights and what it means for policy to actually another role that you've served, which is you were the chairman of the Department of Economics, and even before it was the Department of Economics, the Institute for Volkswirtschaftslehre. For an extended period of time, you're the chairman of the UBS Center, and so you've played this leadership position in the growth of economic research in Zurich. During this time, the department has kind of expanded in terms of the number of professors, the standing internationally in the recognition. So I think that's aside from kind of research accomplishments, that's another kind of pretty big kind of set of achievements I think that all of us here in the department benefit from. What insights or advice would you have to other kind of academic leaders that are interested in kind of creating kind of world-class departments or kind of producing better research environments based on your experience?
Well, it depends from where you start. I mean, here in Zurich, we had some good aspects when we started, because we were kind of well funded in some sense from the university side or from the public side. At the same time, institutionally, we had, I believe, very bad institutions. We had this chair system where professors can exert a lot of power over their students and were at the mercy of their students, were at the mercy of their professors, and it required a lot of political arm wrestling to overcome this institutional deficit. Because it involved that professors sacrifice their resources for the public good of the overall department.
Collective action.
Collective action. And I was heavily involved in making that possible. So for departments in Germany, let's say, other departments in Switzerland, my advice is you have to go down the same road. You have to reform your institutions to generate good incentives for junior researchers so that they can achieve tenure. When we started here, we had no clear route towards tenure for junior professors. And I think you have to change the institution in some way to achieve that. But, in the end, advice is very locally specific here, I would say. In France, the situation may be, again, very different. But what you always need is a few entrepreneurial individuals who have a vision of where they want to go and who build a coalition and push for change.
And going back to the other things we've talked about, I think you also need a sufficiently, you need to make sure you have sufficiently pro-social or collectively minded individuals who are willing to do things like say, yes, I may personally get fewer resources, but it's good for our department and institution, and also better for us as researchers and academic professionals in the long run to have a better, better functioning institutions. So we're willing to go along with these things that kind of make us all better off, rather than what's my piece of the pie and what can I get. And I think that's also a key part of it is making sure you attract the right type of people, which I think.
Yeah, and when I, for example, initiated the abolishment of the old chair system, what did I do? I mean, I recruited, so to speak, a coalition of the willing. These were the pro-social individuals in the department who volunteered to give away resources for the public good. And then you sequentially take on the less and less pro-social people over time. And sometimes you have also to use legal power to bring about behavioral change, So basically, it's a mixture of persuasion, of coalescing with the pro-social people, and also of, I think what you say is very important. We also look, when we hire people, character is also a criterion. We want to know, are these good people, And I think this is, there is more than one department which suffered from having a few lunatics in the department and creating a very toxic atmosphere,
No, I fully agree. I think that's important, and I think this is, the evidence of this department's trajectory points to the importance of making sure not only that you have people who publish well, but also people who kind of contribute and work collectively. And I think that certainly that's something that you prioritizing that has been kind of important. So thanks. I think we've had a very interesting discussion. I've learned a lot in talking about this. So thank you for joining us on this Thought Supply conversation with Professor Ernst Fehr. I want to thank you for your interest and hope that you continue to enjoy the series.